Some inherit fortunes, others inherit dust and memories. I inherited a war I never chose to fight. My father's last will wasn't a gift, it was a cage, and the only key was in the hands of the one man I was raised to hate. How do you choose between survival and betrayal? This is the story of a legacy written in stone, a heart sworn to vengeance, and a choice that would either save me or shatter everything I thought I knew. Stay with me. The air in Mr. Abernathy's law office smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and the stale finality of death. For Ilara Vance, it was the scent of her own life grinding to a halt. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, a single black dress her only armor against the world. Outside, a relentless November rain wept down the tall windows, blurring the grey Chicago skyline into a watercolor of sorrow. It had been a week since her father's funeral, a week of hollowed-out days and nights that stretched into empty infinities. Ilara was a woman carved from resilience, with a slim build that belied an inner strength forged through years of hardship. Her fair skin seemed almost translucent under the office's cold fluorescent lights, and her blonde hair, cut in a practical shoulder-length style, framed a face of quiet determination. At 32, she had learned to bury her emotions deep, a skill taught by a father who saw vulnerability as a fatal flaw. Mr. Abernathy, a kind man with a fringe of white hair and a perpetually worried expression, cleared his throat. He pushed a heavy document across the mahogany desk. "Ilara," he began, his voice gentle, "your father, Richard, was a complicated man, but he loved you. Of that, I have no doubt." Ilara offered a faint, sad smile, but said nothing. Love in the Vance household had always felt complicated. It was a thing of duty and expectation, not warmth. Richard Vance had been a titan of industry, a man who built an empire from nothing and trusted no one. He was hard, demanding, and his approval was a currency she had spent her life trying to earn. But in the end, a sudden heart attack had claimed him, leaving behind a mountain of debt hidden beneath a veneer of success. The creditors were already circling, and the small independent bookstore she had poured her soul into was now on the verge of collapse. She wasn't just grieving a father, she was facing utter ruin. His entire remaining estate, including the trust that funds your business and your home, is outlined here, Abernathy continued, tapping the document. It is substantial, more than enough to clear the debts and secure your future indefinitely. The breath she didn't know she was holding escaped her lips. A wave of relief, so potent it almost made her dizzy, washed over her. For a fleeting moment, she saw a future free from the suffocating anxiety that had become her constant companion. She could save her store. She could breathe again. "However," Abernathy said, and the word hung in the air, heavy and sharp, "there is a condition." Ilara's gaze lifted, her blue eyes meeting his. Of course there was. With her father there was always a condition, a price. He sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the words was a physical burden. "To inherit anything, you must, within 90 days of this reading, be legally married." Ilara's heart sank. Marriage? She had no one. Her life had been a whirlwind of keeping the bookstore afloat and caring for her ailing father. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford to even dream about. "That's impossible," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He knew I wasn't seeing anyone. Why would he do this?" "He believed it would protect you," Abernathy said, though he didn't sound convinced. "But that is not the most challenging part of the stipulation." He paused, his eyes filled with a deep, apologetic pity. He took off his spectacles and polished them slowly, deliberately. "The man you are required to marry," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is Julian Croft." The name struck her like a physical blow. It was a sound of poison, a name that had been cursed in her house for as long as she could remember. The Crofts, a dynasty built on a betrayal that had nearly destroyed her grandfather and set in motion a feud that spanned 3 generations. Daniel Croft, Julian's father, had been her own father's most hated rival, a man Richard Vance blamed for every misfortune, every setback, every crack in their family's foundation. Ilara stared at the lawyer, a bitter, disbelieving laugh escaping her throat. It was a hollow, broken sound. "Julian Croft? Daniel Croft's son? You can't be serious." This wasn't a condition. It was a posthumous act of cruelty, a joke from beyond the grave. Her father must have lost his mind. "It is all here in black and white," Abernathy confirmed, his expression grim. "The union must last for a minimum of 1 year. at which point the inheritance will be transferred to you and you alone. If you refuse, or if Mr. Croft refuses, the entirety of the Vance estate is to be dissolved and donated to charity. The room began to spin. Every escape route she had imagined moments before was now a dead end. To save her life's work, her home, everything she had to bind herself to the embodiment of her family's pain. She had to become a Croft. She pictured Julian from the few times she'd seen him in business journals. A man with a strong athletic build, dark, close-cropped hair and intense, brooding eyes. He had the same ruthless ambition as his father, the same sharp jawline. He was the enemy, the other side of a war she was born into. The thought of standing in a room with him, let alone a life, felt like a violation. Why? She finally asked, her voice trembling with a rage that was slowly eclipsing her grief. Why him? Of all people on earth, why would my father choose him? Mr. Abernathy slid a smaller sealed envelope across the desk. Her name was written on the front in her father's sharp, decisive hand. He left this for you, the lawyer said softly. Perhaps the answer is in there. For a long time, Ilara just stared at it. The letter felt heavier than paper. It felt like a chain. Her father had given her a choice that was no choice at all. Surrender her pride, her name, and her entire history, or lose everything. He had built her a gilded cage and handed the key to the son of his sworn enemy. And as the rain continued its relentless assault on the city, Ilara Vance felt the cold, hard reality of the turning point she now faced. Her survival depended on making peace with a devil she didn't even know. Ilara didn't open the letter in the sterile confines of the law office. She carried it home to her small apartment above the bookstore, the envelope feeling like a block of ice against her skin. The rain had followed her, a constant mournful drumming against the window panes of her reading nook. For hours she just sat there, tracing the sharp, familiar peaks of her father's handwriting. It was the same script that had signed her report cards, the same hand that had written the checks that kept her dreams afloat, and the same one that had now signed her condemnation. Finally, with trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The letter was brutally short, devoid of the sentiment she secretly, foolishly hoped for. It was pure Richard Vance, strategy, logic, and a chilling disregard for the emotional cost. Ilara, do not mistake this for madness. It is the final move in a game you don't yet understand. Our family and the Crofts are not merely rivals. We are two pillars holding up the same crumbling roof. For 30 years, Daniel Croft and I have been locked in a war of mutually assured destruction. But a new threat is on the horizon, one that will not hesitate to crush us both. This marriage is not a punishment. It is an alliance, an armor. Julian Croft is a man forged in the same fire I was. He is pragmatic, ruthless, and, like you, a survivor. You do not have to love him. You simply have to trust that I saw this as the only way to protect what is yours. Survive. That is all I have ever asked of you. The letter didn't offer comfort. It offered a deeper chill, a new threat, crumbling roof. It was maddeningly vague, a puzzle box with no key. But the message was clear. This was not a whim. It was a calculated act of protection from a man who saw the world as a battlefield. He hadn't built her a cage. He had built her a fortress and forced her inside, locking the door behind her. The anger in her chest didn't vanish, but it was joined by a new unsettling feeling, fear of the unknown. The next day, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She found the number for Croft Enterprises, a monolithic tower of steel and glass that loomed over the city's financial district, and asked for Julian Croft. She expected to be blocked by a phalanx of assistants, but the name Ilara Vance was apparently an open sesame. He picked up on the second ring, his voice exactly as she'd imagined, deep, controlled, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. Croft," she began, her own voice tight, "I believe we have a matter of mutual interest to discuss." Silence. Then a low, humorless chuckle. "Miss Vance, I was wondering when you'd call. Shall we say 8 o'clock? The atrium. I'll make a reservation." He hung up before she could respond. The atrium was a place of hushed tones and expensive art, a sterile, neutral ground where fortunes were made and lost over seared scallops and vintage wine. Ilara arrived first, choosing a small table in a secluded corner. When Julian Croft walked in, the quiet hum of the restaurant seemed to dip for a moment. He was taller than she'd expected, his presence filling the space around him. He had a strong, athletic build, neatly encased in a tailored dark suit. His dark hair was cut in a severe, close-cropped style, and his fair skin contrasted sharply with the intensity of his dark eyes. He was handsome in a way that was more intimidating than appealing, his features sharp and unforgiving. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on her. There was no greeting, no handshake. He simply sat, placing his phone face down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Thank you for meeting me," Ilara said, forcing a civility that felt like swallowing glass. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Miss Vance," he replied, his voice a low baritone. "I know why you're here. My father was thorough in his final arrangements. I received a similar package from his attorneys yesterday. It seems our fathers decided to play chess with their children." Ilara was taken aback. "You knew about this? The marriage clause?" A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or weariness crossed his face. "I did. Though I admit I didn't think your father had it in him. Mine, on the other hand, it's exactly the kind of manipulative, sentimental nonsense he'd dream up in his final days." The casual venom with which he spoke about his own father was startling. "So you're saying Daniel Croft is dying?" Julian finished, his tone flat, as if discussing the weather. "Pancreatic cancer. He has months, maybe weeks. And in his quest for a legacy, he has decided this union will be the grand, poetic end to the great Vance-Croft War, a final Magdalen masterpiece." He looked at her then, a direct, penetrating gaze that seemed to peel back her layers of composure. "My father has made it a condition of my inheritance as well. If I don't marry you, I lose controlling interest in the company my grandfather built. So you see, Miss Vance, we are in the same gilded cage." This was the twist she never saw coming. She had imagined herself a lone victim, a pawn being sacrificed to a king. But he was a pawn too. He wasn't the predator in this story, he was just the other prisoner. The revelation shifted the ground beneath her feet. The rage that had been a burning coal in her stomach cooled slightly, replaced by a strange, disorienting sense of parity. They were both trapped. "My father's letter mentioned a threat," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Something that would destroy both our families." Julian's jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw a crack in his armor of indifference. "He would put that in a letter," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "Our father's war made them powerful, but it also made them enemies, vicious ones. Now that they are both leaving the board, there are vultures circling, eager to pick the bones of two weakened empires. A merger, sealed by marriage, is the only thing that makes us untouchable." He finally laid it all out. It wasn't about love or hate or even forgiveness. It was about survival, just as her father's letter had said. A cold, brutal, corporate necessity dressed up in the language of a family feud. "So this is a business deal," Ilara stated, the reality of it crystallizing. "That's all it's ever been," he confirmed. 1 year. We play our parts, we secure our futures, and we walk away. No emotion, no complications. A contract. She looked at this man, this stranger who held the key to her entire life. He was the enemy, the son of the man who had haunted her father's every waking moment. But in his eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a reflection of her own predicament, a quiet desperation, masked by a steely resolve. It wasn't comforting, but it was understandable. "There will be rules," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it had. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I would expect nothing less." She extended a hand across the table. It was a gesture of truce, not of warmth. After a moment's hesitation, he took it. His grip was firm, cool, and brief, a handshake sealing the most important contract of their lives. "To a successful merger, Mr. Croft. To survival, Miss Vance." The wedding was a transaction, held in the hushed, impersonal chamber of a downtown courthouse. Ilara wore a simple cream-colored dress, Julian a dark gray suit. Their only witnesses were their lawyers. They spoke their vows in quiet, steady voices, the words stripped of all sanctity, reduced to the legal activation of a contract. When the justice of the peace said, "You may kiss the bride," there was a beat of excruciating silence. Julian leaned in, his lips brushing her cheek for a fraction of a second. It was a touch as cold and brief as the winter air outside. There was no celebration, no pretense. They walked out of the courthouse as Mr. and Mrs. Croft, two strangers bound by ink and desperation. Their new home was a modern, minimalist penthouse apartment, chosen by Julian for its neutrality and security. It was a space of clean lines, polished concrete floors, and vast windows that looked out over a city that felt a million miles away. It belonged to neither of them, a sterile no-man's land where their truce could be observed. They established their rules with a chilling efficiency: separate bedrooms, separate social lives, and a public front of amicable unity for the benefit of their respective boards. They were polite, distant ghosts haunting the same beautiful empty shell. For a month, the arrangement worked. They moved around each other with a carefully choreographed indifference. Ilara focused on saving her bookstore, using the first disbursement of the trust to clear its debts. Julian worked relentlessly, consolidating the two companies into a force formidable enough to ward off any corporate predator. The war outside their walls seemed to have been held at bay. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with the soft thud of a courier package left outside their door. It was a plain brown box with no return address, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Croft. Ilara brought it inside, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Julian was at a late meeting, and the apartment was unnervingly quiet. Inside the box was a single, expensive-looking photo album. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first few pages were filled with old, faded photographs of her father and Daniel Croft, but they weren't the bitter rivals she knew. They were young men, barely in their 20s, standing side by side, grinning, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They were partners, friends. In one photo, a third man stood with them, his face unfamiliar, but his smile just as wide. Beneath the last photo was a small typewritten note. History has a way of repeating itself. The foundations you stand on are made of sand, and the tide is coming in. When Julian came home hours later, he found her in the cavernous living room, sitting in the dark, the album open on the coffee table. The city lights cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. "What is this?" he asked, his voice sharp with alarm as he saw her pale, stricken face. "You tell me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You tell me what this business deal of ours is really about. Because this has nothing to do with fending off vultures. This is about something else, something you knew. My father's letter, your father's last wish. It was all a lie, wasn't it?" He looked at the open album, and the blood drained from his face. The cold, impenetrable mask he always wore finally cracked. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "Where did you get this?" "It was delivered today," she said, her voice rising with a desperate need for the truth. "No more contracts, Julian. No more rules. You owe me the truth. My entire life has been defined by my father's hatred for your family. I have a right to know what I've been sacrificed for." He stared out the window for a long moment, his reflection a faint ghost against the glittering skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of its usual control. "The feud was real, Ilara. The hatred, the rivalry. It was all real, but it wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the cover-up." He sank onto the sofa opposite her, the first time he had ever looked anything less than powerful. "The third man in those pictures is Marcus Thorne. He was their partner. The three of them started together, brilliant and ambitious. But my father and yours, they were more ruthless. They saw a path to the top that didn't include a third seat. During a critical acquisition, they framed him, falsified documents, shifted blame for a financial collapse they engineered. Thorne lost everything and went to prison for fraud. Your father and mine split the empire that should have been his." Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. It was a truth so monstrous, it felt impossible to absorb. Her father, the man of unwavering principles she had so desperately tried to please, was a thief, a liar. "Thorne was released from prison 2 months ago," Julian continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He has evidence. The original documents, testimony, everything he needs to prove what they did. He doesn't want money. He wants to burn it all to the ground. Our companies, our names, our legacies. He wants to see us in the ruins, just like they left him." The second, devastating twist landed. The threat wasn't a competitor. It was a ghost from their father's past, back to claim his vengeance. The marriage, the alliance, it wasn't a shield against the world. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to consolidate their assets and fight a war they were destined to lose. "Our fathers knew he was coming," Julian said, his eyes dark with a pain she recognized because it mirrored her own. "They knew the only way to survive the storm was to lash the two ships together. This marriage, it was their final confession, their only apology. In that moment, the entire narrative of her life crumbled. The feud, the bitterness, the inherited hatred, it was all a facade, a 30-year play to hide a foundational sin. She looked at Julian, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw past the name Croft. She saw a man who had lived his entire life knowing this truth, trying to hold together an empire built on a lie. He wasn't her jailer, he was her fellow inmate. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed for her father now fell freely. They were tears of rage, of grief, of a profound and shattering disillusionment. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been using her to protect his own dark secret. She wasn't Mrs. Croft, a name she despised. She wasn't Elara Vance, the dutiful daughter. She was just a woman sitting in the wreckage of a life she never knew was false. And across from her sat the one person on earth who understood. The enemy had become her only ally. The turning point had come not at an altar, but in a dark room filled with the ghosts of their father's sins. And for the first time, survival felt less like a contract and more like a shared, terrifying battlefield. The silence that followed Julian's confession was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of 30 years of deception. The barrier of animosity between them didn't just break, it evaporated, leaving two profoundly lonely people exposed in the wreckage of their family's legacies. For the first time, Elara saw Julian not as a Croft, but as a man who had carried the burden of this truth alone for years. The coldness she had mistaken for arrogance was a shield, forged to protect himself from the poison of his own inheritance. In the days that followed, the unspoken rules of their arrangement dissolved. The penthouse, once a sterile territory of divided spaces, became a shared war room. They spent late nights at the long dining table, surrounded by old financial records and legal documents, piecing together the full extent of their father's crime. He would make coffee, wordlessly placing a mug beside her as she read, and she would find herself tracing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a strange, unexpected ache of empathy blooming in her chest. They were no longer acting as CEO and bookstore owner. They were partners, equals, in a crisis that belonged to them both. She saw the sharp, strategic mind her father had mentioned in his letter, but she also saw a weariness in him, a deep-seated desire for an honorable peace he never thought possible. He, in turn, saw the quiet resilience that had kept her afloat, not as stubbornness, but as an unyielding moral core. "We could fight him," Julian said one night, staring at a picture of Marcus Thorne. "Our legal teams are the best. We could bury him in litigation for years." Elara looked up from the ledger she was studying. "And become them?" she asked softly. "Repeat the same cycle of destruction? Is that what survival means?" Her question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. That was the moment their father's final strategy truly died. To follow their path, the path of aggression and ruthless self-preservation, would be to validate the very sin that had led them here. Survival had to mean something more than just keeping the money. It had to mean breaking the chain. It was Elara who found Marcus Thorne. He was living in a small, modest home in a quiet suburb, a man erased from the world he helped build. They went to see him together, without lawyers. They found him in his garden, an older man with silver hair and eyes that held a lifetime of sorrow. He looked at them, at the children of the men who had destroyed him, with a weary resignation, expecting a threat or a paltry settlement offer. Instead, Elara spoke. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice clear and steady, "we are not here to fight you, we're here to apologize." They told him everything they knew. They acknowledged the crime, the greed, the decades of injustice. They didn't make excuses for their fathers. They laid the truth bare. Then Julian made him an offer that went far beyond what any court would have awarded. It wasn't just financial restitution, it was a public exoneration. They would restore his name, give him a significant stake in the new merged company, and create a foundation in his name to help others who had been wrongfully convicted. It was not a settlement, it was atonement. Thorne listened, his expression unreadable. When they finished, tears were streaming down his weathered face. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he looked at them both, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened. "For 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, "all I wanted was for someone to admit the truth. You have given me back more than my name." The war was over. The threat was gone. Driving back to the city, a profound quiet filled the car. The weight that had defined both their lives had been lifted. They had faced the ghosts of the past, not by fighting them, but by making peace. Months passed. The companies were stabilized, Thorne's story was told, and a new, more honest foundation was laid. The one-year anniversary of their courthouse wedding approached, the date their contract would be fulfilled. They were free. One crisp autumn afternoon, Julian found Elara in her bookstore. The little shop was bright and filled with customers, a testament to her love and hard work. He walked to the back, where she was unboxing new arrivals, the scent of paper and ink, a comforting perfume. "The lawyers called today," he said, his voice quiet amidst the store's gentle hum. "Everything is finalized. You can dissolve the marriage anytime you wish." Ilara stopped, a book held gently in her hands. She looked up at him. Over the past year, his face had lost its hard edges. The intensity in his eyes was still there, but now it was tempered with a warmth she had come to know intimately. Their shared crisis had forged a bond stronger than any contract, a bond of mutual respect, deep understanding, and a quiet, unspoken affection that had grown in the space where hatred used to be. "This was never about a contract, Julian," she said softly. "Not really. It was about finding a way through the wreckage." He stepped closer, his hand coming to rest over hers on the cover of the book. His touch was no longer cold. It was steady and warm and real. "And what if," he said, his voice a low murmur, "the way through leads us to a new beginning, not one written by our fathers, but one we write ourselves." She turned her hand over, her fingers lacing with his. A slow smile spread across her face, genuine and radiant. "I think," she said, "I'd like that very much." Outside, the leaves were turning, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. It was a season of change, of letting go. For Ilara and Julian, it was the beginning of their own story. A story not of inherited war, but of a peace they had chosen, a love they had earned, and a future they would build together, free from the shadows of the past.